right, well, thank you all for coming today. So I'm Jessica Beam, a park ranger at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site just down the road. And this is part of our Civil War Leaders and Legacies program that we do. And this one is Burying the Dead, the aftermath of a Civil War battle. And if you might not know from the title, this will deal with the dead and dying and wounded after the Civil War, which means that there might be graphic depictions or pictures of such events during that time period. So just as a warning ahead of time, there might be pictures or descriptions that you may see throughout the talk. And this is not a talk about the specific battles during the Civil War. This is more of going into the aftermath of said battle. So generally, and then with a few battles picked out for the history of that, going all the way to today and what those battlefields look like today that you might see. So without further ado, the main way that we know about all of this after the Civil War is thanks to the records that we have. And the records that we have that talk about the people being affected by this is thanks to letters and diaries that have been preserved and saved by people that lived and lived through that horror. And they helped bring home the horrors of the war to many at that time. This is a time when you have technologies that are allowing people to get information a lot faster. You have photographs that can carry pictures of devastation and destruction to homes, into your houses, and you have the telegraph so you could get notice that your loved ones have died or are injured or have been taken prisoner very quickly. Not as quickly as today, obviously, but a lot quicker than other wars that the U.S. was part of. And this, the Civil War was in itself a lot different because it was families fighting against families. It's the thing we always hear about, brother against brother. And it was true. I mean, these people are fighting, some of them from the same family on different sides of the conflict. Now, the men and women that are quoted, or will be quoted in this talk, are from various parts of the United States and Confederate states at that time. And thankfully, their letters and diaries have been preserved by families or by institutions and digitized, where you can access them anywhere, and where you can read more than just a snippet about a specific battle, but read all about that person's life and their resources and their descendants are the ones who wrote the history of the United States Civil War. That's where we have all the information, and every person and group kind of put their own spin on that history that they have. And so in this talk, we're going to kind of see it through their points of view, because this isn't a topic that you can kind of dehumanize. This is the most humanizing of topics, which is death. It's something that happens, and it's something that we are interested in. It's something we're curious about. And so through this and through these people like Major William Child, we can learn about the Civil War battles and the aftermath of that. Now, in general, the Civil War killed more than 620,000 Americans, displaced millions of men, women, and children, and turned once thriving lands into what are now national cemeteries. It was into the homes of people a lot more than any other war, thanks to those technologies that we have. And people took advantage of that. We have Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner taking photographs and promoting them all across the country to show what this new technology could do and what is happening during the war. And it was a way to not dismiss what's going on. Once you have a picture of Antietam in your hands, you can't ignore what's going on. It's right there. This is real and what's happened. And so it was a way that that allowed for people at that time to really feel the effect of the devastation. The variety of wars prior to the United States Civil War, Indian Wars, foreign wars, the War of 1812, the American Revolution, Mexican-American War, all of those were horrible, horrible things, but they weren't able to be brought in almost instantaneously into people's homes. You couldn't find out the next day, see a whole list of people in your newspaper about who had died. You can't see a photograph that was taken just after a man had fallen. You would see paintings later on. And so it really brought the war right into the front of people's consciousness and into their backyards, and it could reach people all over the country. So it wasn't just going to paintings and images that went to schools or universities or people that could afford them. Anybody could go in and see. Like Matthew Brady had a traveling gallery that would show these pictures. This particular quote is from when it was in Kentucky. Not Kentucky, sorry. We'll see you next time. But it would travel around and he would show people, and anyone would be able to come to the gallery and see it. It wasn't something that was limited. And so Kansas, sorry. Another thing that really made it hard is you see the mass amount of coffins coming home. You have all of these men coming out, some from the same town that go out in the same regiment, and they could all be killed in one battle. And so you have all these coffins coming home, and adding to that letters that you're getting from your loved ones in the field. Adding all of that is a way that people at home, you know, women, children that aren't able to be out there, men that weren't able to fight, could feel that effect of the battle as if it was, you know, right there in their home. And because we have all of that, those resources, and those people were so affected by that, it really changed how people dealt with the aftermath of a battle, the aftermath of the war. Because prior to this, it was out of the way. It wasn't necessarily in your own backyard, in your own town, where you had to help the sick, you had to help the dying because they're there. And it really changed the way that the military dealt with death, with dying soldiers, and the way the consciousness of the American public changed on just the view towards death at that time. Now, just in general, during the 1860s, obviously even today, there are plenty of ways to die. Fighting was just one of the many ways. Of course, it's a very fine way. But soldiers could die from, they had to deal with unsanitary conditions, snipers, illnesses, and threats of execution. If you deserted the army and you were caught, you'd be executed as a way to show an example to other soldiers that might want to choose that path in their life and to deter them from doing that. And wounded soldiers that are lying on the battlefield, they could be taken to a field hospital and operated on, or they could be stuck on the battlefield for hours or days afterwards as cleanup goes on, depending on how large the battle was and the situation they were in. And even if they got to the field hospital, they could still die from gangrene or just from infections and from the wound itself. Conditions in the field in general involved everything from trekking up mountains, through muddy bogs, in all kinds of weather, rain, snow, sun, anything imaginable, because this war went on for years, all year round. They didn't stop in inclement weather. It just kept going. And unsafe and unsanitary conditions, like conditions that they're in, illnesses that ran rampant, it meant that diseases ran through the army camps very easily, and that would transfer to civilians nearby if you were camping near a town. And so you had this effect of diseases that would get into the army camps would sometimes head out to the people nearby. And those diseases are everything, a non-comprehensive list includes typhoid fever, typhus, smallpox, pneumonia, malaria, diarrhea, measles, and tuberculosis. Now, soldiers are coming from all over the country at this time, and some of them are better suited to deal with these illnesses and these conditions than others. And so some soldiers survived through these illnesses. They went home, got better, came back, or they got better in the hospitals, and others wouldn't make it. More soldiers died from illness during the war than from fighting in general, and just because of the wide variety of conditions at that time. But ignoring all of that, this is a talk about the aftermath of a battle. And so soldiers could face almost certain death in battle. Now at that time, it's a little hard to read, but there's a whole culture of how you die at this time, and it's called good death. So you have to die a good death. And the way that that's accomplished, the way that you have a good death is you die by your family's side. You say your last words, you've made your peace with your maker, and your last words are words of comfort to your loved ones. And that's a good death. That's the way that you would have it. And in this time period, you can't have that. You have men and boys dying hundreds of miles away from their loved ones in conditions that the loved ones don't even know. They might not have had a chance to see a chaplain before they pass. You don't know if they've been able to change their life and make their peace with their maker and things like that. And so it changes the way that people at home are dealing with this, because you don't know if your loved one died a good death. But there's ways that a soldier could ensure that he did. You could, right before going into a battle, some soldiers would write what might be their last words in their journals or diaries. They might write a letter to their loved ones that would be sent if they did pass away, if they thought ahead. Some soldiers, if a close friend passed away, that soldier would write a letter to the fallen soldier's family to let them know that they had died and that had passed, with their last breath wishing, life for their children or something like that. And some soldiers could only be identified by their clothing if they could. And so there was a lot of unknowing during this time. And because there was that need to have a good death, newspapers, like the two examples here, where they explain in the first top right-hand corner, it said, Richard was a good, brave soldier and met death like a hero and a Christian. And so that's a way of telling, that he died a good death. The other person, his only regrets were for the people that he's leaving behind. And so that's, having a good death. You're making your peace, you're comforting your family. And, papers would do that. They would try to continue that culture of making sure that your loved ones died in that way so that you would have comfort knowing that, they were going to heaven and they were dying this good death. But in some cases, you didn't have the chance. Thousands of men were listed as missing during the course of the war, and many thousands of dead soldiers could never be identified. There was no effective way to identify the casualties at that time through either army, Confederate or the Union. And so it was really hard to get the message to the right people. It was a situation where, you could think that this person had passed away, that they had died, but you have no identification. They didn't have dog tags at that time or any way to really know. It was just the roster in the morning, the roster at night, and if they didn't show up for one, and it was after a battle and you didn't know where they went, they could be anywhere at that time. Even getting a message across from one company to another during a battle was a risk. You didn't even know if you were going to be able to just send a message anywhere. And since, as I mentioned, men were pulled locally, they could come from all the same town, the family could lose all of their boys, all of their men in one fell swoop in one battle that killed thousands of people. And in the chance of say the Union lost that battle, they would be retreating. And in some cases, they were retreating as fast as they possibly could. And you didn't know who you were leaving behind until days later, maybe. You didn't know who was left wounded, if they were still wounded on the field, if they were taken in as captured, or if they had died. And so you have that unknowing as well, just to get that information. And something that came from that is, in some cases, families would try to travel to the battlefields to find their loved ones. And so you have a lot of movement going on of people, not just the armies fighting, because this is a battle that affects everyone. And they would write letters like this particular one that a father's writing to a colonel in the Confederate Army asking for information about his son, with a picture saying, so the little PS is really hard to read, but it's essentially saying, I enclosed a photograph of my son. The photograph is pictured. In case he's dead, this can be used to identify his body. And this is something that you saw. I mean, he's writing to the enemy side at that time, wanting to know what happened to his very young son. Took out the part, but he's, 19 years old. And this is a time when there's a need to find these people, and people stepped up. So you have Clara Barton, the American Red Cross. They created ways to identify missing soldiers, to kind of organize the information for the Army, especially the Union Army at that time. And they were able to help thousands of people find their loved ones again, whether they've been deceased or they were wounded or captured. And that was something that really gave comfort to people, knowing that there are people trying to find their loved ones. In the case of David King, his son was captured, wounded on the field, and taken to a prisoner camp in Richmond, and eventually let go, and then did not survive the condition during the camp and his wound. And so he did pass away. But he did, hear news that his son was alive in a prisoner camp, and so they did have that communication going back and forth. But, still he had no idea, and he wasn't allowed to go and see. And a lot of people were trying to go and see at that time. And because all of this is going on in towns, there's no defined one way of dealing with this mass amount of loss of life and people everywhere. And so individual armies, like individual sections of the armies, created different ways of dealing with casualties after a battle. There was no set governance, especially on the Union side, about how to deal with the wounded, how to deal with where are they going, who's going to take care of them, where are they going to go. And in some cases, they were carried off the field by whoever was there. It might be soldiers that are left behind to kind of care for the dead or the wounded. It might be townspeople. It might be no one might carry them off the field and they just might lay there. And so it's, there was no set way of doing it. And the men that were stuck on the field were exposed to the elements. They were possibly surrounded by other dead bodies. So you have pestilence going through and you have wild animals and the enemy to avoid and to hide from. And so you needed that support of people in nearby towns to come and help and to really help anybody. And for towns, it also had a secondary meaning of getting the dead off of the area, but also dead bodies are going to have pestilence. It's going to spread disease, and you don't want that nearby water, your drinking water. You don't want that nearby your fields. And so there was a secondary need to just clear it for safety for the people living there. And towns could shut down and just say, okay, nothing's going to happen. We have to clear the wounded. We have to clear the fields and take care of everything. And in some cases, the wounded would be filling every open spot in any home in town. And these aren't large towns like we think of today, small towns. And the wounded would be in every building, using every bed. Now, eventually groups were formed that cared for the wounded, that had a set way of dealing with people coming in, with wounded, with the dead. And they would also help identify the dead, and they were called ambulance corps. And the first one that was successful was created by the Army of the Potomac in the Union, and it was in 1862 in August. And that's when it first had a list of exactly what people had to do. There was requirements for people that were working with the wounded. There were rules about who could go onto the field, who could carry people off, how to get the information about who these soldiers were. And that was also allowed for first aid and transportation, so getting wounded to actual hospitals and taking trains and things like that. And so that's where that first really organized effort started. And because that was successful, it eventually, the whole Union Army adopted those practices through an act of Congress, and that was in March of 1864. That it was fully Army-wide. These are the practices to deal with the dead through General Order Number 106. And that's in 1864, so this is quite a while afterwards, but the ambulance corps helped with standardizing the creation of field hospitals. And so hospitals that would pop up right after a battle, where they would go, how close to water they would be, who would be inside of them, and the treatment of the men to make sure that, you know, the ones who were wounded that were probably going to survive would be dealt with first, because they had the most likelihood to survive that treatment. And the field hospitals could be intense. They could be in buildings, just depending on where they are, what the conditions are like, and depending on like how close the fighting is to where they are. Soldiers would take the train to local hospitals as soon as they were able to. So if they were not a risk for infection at that time, they would go immediately. If they still needed to be operated on, if something like that happened, they could be dealt with on the field. And that was something really important to really help with the mass casualties coming in, so that not every wounded man passed away, that you had a survival rate. And some soldiers, if they were laid on the field and they were from the opposing side, they would be taken care of. They would be given not as good of care, but they would be taken care of and then sent to prisoner of war camps. And so they were still given care, and you'd see wounded coming in throughout the day and the days after fighting ended. And surgeons for the Army, when the war started, they had less than 50 for the whole Army, and then they kept adding more because the need was there, and they would be operating for hours at a time. They would just be coming one after the other. Soldier would put on the table, surgery would be done, and moved over, and it would just be constant. If, depending on how close the wound was to the body, like if it was on like a far extremity, you had a higher survival rate. So the closer it was to your torso, the less chance you had of surviving through the surgery, surviving through the injury in general. And so it was really made sure that the surgeons just did the surgeries and you had other people there that would help to identify who would be the best person to have the next surgery done. But, I mean, while you're waiting to have a surgery done, you're still at risk of infection, even after the surgery. And so there's still that risk. The bullets used were a lot more destructive than other bullets at that time. And that meant that a lot of limbs were shattered on impact. And so it wasn't just, it'd go right through, it shattered bones. And that meant that once again, closer to the torso, if you've got, a shattered collarbone, that's a huge issue rather than a shattered wrist. And the way that you would do the amputation, so this is an image of a general's amputation, so it's much fancier, a lot cleaner than a regular private, but the process would generally involve, lying on a bloody table, being operated on a soldier that has blood all over him. Sanitation was not priority at that time. It was mostly speed. You had to get them in because you have so many more men coming in and getting that done. And 1 in 13 soldiers during the Civil War went home missing at least one limb. And so you have a lot of surgeries being done. Now the process involved, laying on a sometimes bloody table. You get chloroform or some kind of anesthesia if you were lucky. And generally they tried to avoid operating on people without some kind of form of general anesthesia. That was the goal. They didn't want to operate on people without that, but it may have happened. And the surgeon would make the cut to the bone, and then how else are you going to get the bone off? You have to saw it off. There were other surgeries that were done, not just removing the entire limb. You could get what's called a incision that would remove parts of your limb and then sew it back together, so you'd come home with a much shorter arm or much shorter leg. So they wouldn't have to remove the entire arm to fix something, depending on what the damage was, how bad it was, things like that. And so you really didn't want to put a picture of a soldier with that procedure done, because it is really not very good. But it was speed. You wanted to save these soldiers' lives. You wanted to get them, if they had an opened wound, that was a much bigger infection risk than just having, a sewed up wound that's being healed. Now, help did come through sanitary commissions, sanitary commissions and Christian commissions that formed as civilian run, but they were authorized by the United States government to help the army. So they would pretty much follow along behind the armies. They had supplies, they had doctors, they had food, they had everything for these soldiers to care for them, because civilians noticed that the soldiers weren't getting the best care. And smaller groups, so the U.S. Sanitary Commission was the overall group that did this, and smaller groups like the Soldiers' Aid Society in Cleveland would be the small branches of that, and there were branches all across the country. And they would organize, they would raise money through fairs, through sales, through different things like that. And it could be, the way you could contribute is anything from sending in money, sending in a care package to soldiers, or going out into the field and helping yourself. And so there were lots of different ways to help and to be helped as soldiers. And they also helped locate missing men. Something that's really nice is what they had is a lot of branches that would set up safe houses for soldiers. If they were weary, if they were wounded, they could go to these houses all across the country and find care. And it was a place that you didn't have to pay for it, you just kind of went there, all through the Sanitary Commission. And the Christian Commission also worked in the same general way, although they would also help with the religious aspect of it as well. So Sanitary Commission is pretty much just the care for the soldiers. The Christian Commission went more so with the care and also moral well-being of the soldiers. But they were both out there just trying to help, and it was all volunteer work. It was all volunteers coming in. And to circle back, it gave people at home the feeling that this is going to allow my loved one to have a good death, because you have these people out there caring, and they're going to get the care that they need at that time. Now, in the battle in general, you would have the battle going, and then it would end, and then you'd have nothing. But you could also call a truce in the middle of a battle, or at a lull in the battle, I should say, and that would allow both sides to come to the field and collect their dead and wounded. Now, the truce could be as long or as short as the winning side wanted. It could be you have a truce of a day to collect all of your dead, and if you have 1,500 dead, you're not going to collect them all in a day. You're going to collect the important ones, which sounds really bad, but at that time you're going to want the generals, the people, the officers, you're going to want them to be back, and then whoever else you can get. And so it was a different time. And I mean, these two quotes here are from different sides of the war. One's Confederate and one's Union. And it's both giving this idea that, this is a horrible time, but the truces, both sides thought that they should be granted more time to deal with their dead and their dying. And truces would be sometimes not given at all. And the winning side would say, no, we're just going to deal with all of it. You need to leave. You need to leave this area. We're not going to let you come in and take any of your dead or wounded. And that was a very real fear that people had, because if the winning side is going to bury the enemy dead and wounded, they're not going to do it in the most appropriate way, identifying them, giving them proper burials. And you really didn't have a choice. You were running away. You had to leave. You had to retreat. And at that time, you didn't really have caskets for everyone. This is a mass amount of people dying. You didn't have caskets. And so it could be a quick burial in a casket in an individual grave. It could be the soldiers stripped entirely of any clothing, any articles that they have, and then pushed into a shallow grave. It could be anything between that, depending on the time, the resources, and the desire of either side to do that. Mass graves were a very common thing for both sides, winning side. So if you couldn't put all of the dead in one, you would identify where they are, and they would be in a mass grave in a very tasteful way. So they still have their identifying pieces on. If you're the winning side and you're burying the opposing side, the mass grave would just be whatever hole you can find, essentially. And there was that really meant that it's not covered properly. A mass grave does not mean it's really deep. And so you might have the issue that was a very real thing of, skeletons coming out of the ground. As the ground shifts, as things change, they're gonna pop up. And that was something that happened anywhere from weeks after. If there was a big rain and washed away all the topsoil, that could happen. It could happen years later as the ground shift or as development comes through. And identifying where these graves are was not a priority necessarily. You would say where your side's graves are, but just generally say they were in a hole over here. That's where they were. And it meant that both sides were dramatized as savage. So in the South, you would hear these stories of Southern dead being just rolled into holes and not treated with any dignity whatsoever. And in the North, you would hear the same exact thing about the other side. And so you have a lot of dramatization to show each side as savage, to kind of continue that feeling which is already there of animosity between the sides, because they're not treating their dead appropriately. Now, they would also have the issue of shallow graves means that it's very easy for them to be dug up. And you have wild animals like dogs and hogs that are going to find those things, that are going to eat those things and disperse the remains. And they would come at night after a battle. They knew where the food was and they would find it. And that meant that there was a lot of issues with that. The dead bodies that were left would be dealt with in various ways. They might be stripped entirely by the army. They might be stripped by civilians that need money, that are looking for things to sell. I mean, you never really know at that time, because they were essentially free game. If the armies had left, moved on, and there was no one left to guard or to clean up after it, people would take what they needed. They would take the supplies that were left. And something that would happen is, especially with officers' bodies, is they would be taken by the opposing side and held and given back eventually, and say, we have your general's body here. We have it here. We'll give it back to you at some point. And depending on where they are in the battle, what the feelings are, what the sentiment is, it might be a more more amicable transaction than we might think. It's not like holding them for ransom. It's holding them, in some cases, just to ensure that they were given back, because officers are a higher rank. Rules were put in place to avoid bodies being robbed, to avoid looting in general through the army, because it was a big deal. It was an issue. But you don't really have a lot of enforcement of those rules at that time. And so there were a lot of reports on either side of desecrating old graves, if you know where they're buried. Some such reports went to the north about Confederate soldiers. When they retook a Union battlefield, they would desecrate the graves. One report, which did not put, is, stories that they're using skulls as mugs and things like that, which there's no way to prove that being correct or not. But it was one of the ways that, this horrible way of dealing with the dead was being told at that time. And now you're not sure if your loved ones have a good death. You're not even sure where they are, if they've died. And there was a push to make sure you have your loved ones back in, in your home, in your family burial plot. And so there was a push to get bodies back wherever they had been buried, which went through various issues, because you had to have the money to be able to, pay for a casket to go out there, someone to dig up that body. It could be weeks after. It could be months after. The Union Army did start a process of moving bodies to national cemeteries, but that was after the war had ended, a few years after. And so if you, paid enough, you could have your loved ones' remains sent, whatever remains there might be, and most of the funerals were closed casket, as you might imagine. And so there's no real way of knowing that you got your whole loved one back, or even if you could. But it's the little ways that you wanted to do it to really give people closure and get that physical evidence that people need to, have that done. Now, you finally have legislation for national cemeteries, and this is a lot, but this is just an example of the creation of a national cemetery. These were first created near battlefields. Some of them were existing cemeteries, some of them were just land that was given and donated, and they allowed for the soldiers to be moved to these cemeteries. Confederate soldiers were not allowed to be buried in national cemeteries in the beginning, and that caused a lot of issues, because the soldiers, the Army would send out divisions to go and collect the dead bodies and have them moved, or they would hire people. Like, this is the recollection of a boy who helped his father after Gettysburg, moving bodies from the battlefield to the cemetery. And so you might be hired on to do that. That's what towns would do if they had the resources. And because Confederate bodies were not allowed to be in national cemeteries, they were generally left where they were. Eventually they could go to national cemeteries. Some had separate sections, but they wouldn't be marked. And eventually, in 1906, the U.S. Army started marking Confederate burials, but the ones who died on northern soil, I should say. And in these cemeteries were pretty much just used cemeteries, but the ways that we know national cemeteries today with the headstones and things like that, that really started with an act of Congress in 1867 that meant that they had to have a marker for every burial, they had to have proper fencing, and a registry of the soldiers resting at that cemetery, which was a problem because a lot of it was unknown. You didn't know where the soldiers were, you didn't know who they were, but you could get, government headstones like we have today for soldiers. And this was a process that took months. The Gettysburg the cemetery there was established, and then before the Gettysburg Address, they were working that entire about 4-month period to get all of those set up. Now, the government did have a way of getting the soldiers, so not just Gettysburg, where the soldiers were buried on the battlefield and then moved to the cemetery down the road. There were battles all across the country, and so there was a systematic way of finding the Union soldiers not buried in proper cemeteries. And that started in 1865, going out to each battlefield, trying to identify where the remains are and bringing them back to the nearest national cemetery. Now, there were originally 14 national cemeteries started in 1862, so you have them as close to main areas as possible, but you really have to go out and find the dead bodies. And this was done through the United States Quartermaster General. Send out troops, get them identified and reinterred. And this process took about 5 years. And it was not entirely 100% successful, because there's some we don't know where they were. There's some that could not be moved back. Some that were moved. And at this time when they're doing this is still before Confederates could be buried in the Union cemeteries. And so sometimes they would just be left as is. And so whatever Confederate burials were there, they would be left. And the Daughters of the Confederacy started these programs where they could have memorials for their soldiers and cemeteries for their soldiers. And so there were other people working to make sure all of the soldiers got a proper burial at that time. Now, the remains of soldiers buried in private lots, so if the soldiers were able to be buried at home, they could finally get markers in their own private cemeteries, not just in the national cemeteries, by 1879. And so prior to that, you had your own family headstone, or you didn't have one if you were in a private. Now, your soldiers can get that headstone no matter where they're going to be buried. Now, it wasn't only people on the battlefields. You had supplies and you had animals, and main animal, horses at that time. And they were not treated as well as we would treat horses today. I mean, there were limited rations, long treks, horses would go lame, horses would run out of food, and they would be put down, some would be put down so the other side wouldn't use them, which was a tactic used quite a bit for food. And you would take any useful things off of the horses and then move on. And so you have a lot of dead horses around. And not necessarily a priority. They're not people. They were horses. And so the bodies would be moved to outskirts of town, and generally the way to deal with that is burning them, which smells. Another way of dealing with it is one that you can get a little money from, which civilians did, and that is to let the body just decompose on its own and sell the bones. One way that the bones were used at that time was imitation ivory. Problem is that also smells. And so dealing with the horses, not just dead bodies of humans, but dealing with the dead bodies of the horses, because they're larger, takes a lot longer, there's a lot more going on, it smelled for miles and for weeks. And that was anywhere the army went through. The armies went through, that would be a problem. And these battles happened around people's homes, in people's areas. And so fields would be picked clean by armies, and in some cases the retreating army would destroy crops so that the winning side would not be able to use them. And that was a fairly common tactic. And it took some fields and forests years to recover. There are things called witness trees around battlefields that were still standing, at that time, that would have been riddled with bullet shells and different pieces. And, supplies left on battlefields. We all know treasure seekers, things like that, that's a problem because they were left behind and then pushed into the ground or moved. And they became artifacts that you can still sometimes find on battlefields today. Now, you have a lot of civilians going on, and the civilians have big worries, especially if it's a town that's being under siege at the time, because who's going to deal with all of this? Who's going to pay for all of this? Because the ambulance corps wasn't created until 1864. And so prior to that, who's going to deal with this? Who's in charge of this? No one knows. And so it would be up to a lot of people. And something that people would do is create a tally of what they lost during the battle, like their crops, things like that, and then apply for compensation from the government. And you needed to have witnesses to the issues. You needed to have community support. Otherwise, you weren't getting a cent of money from the government as compensation for your loss. And in some cases, you just wouldn't get it in general. And so it was something that, people lost crops, they lost things for years sometimes, because just because the battle ended didn't mean the army left necessarily. The army could still be in the area eating all of your crops for months afterwards. And so that's a lot of just issues, and this was a way of, this particular quote is slightly morbidly funny because the man writing this is complaining about this old lady coming in yelling about what's going to happen to all of these dead things, and his response is, I just need to get away from here, and then he just left as soon as possible. Little way of inciting some humor, but we're going to kind of switch a little bit and go from just in generals to specific battles, because every area was dealt with differently. And the information about the specific battles came from the National Park Service resources and the Civil War Trust, and the casualty numbers include killed, wounded, and missing or captured. And so we're going to see how the battlefields were dealt with after the war, and what's going on today, what happened to them today. And we're going to start with Wilson's Creek, which was called Battle of Oak Hills as well, 2 names. And it was in Greene and Christian counties, Missouri. It took place on August 10th, 1861, with an estimated 1,235 casualties on the Union side and 1,095 casualties on the Confederate side, and it was a Confederate victory. This battle took place over more than 6 hours and 1,700 acres in Missouri. It was the second major battle in the Civil War, and it was the first general casualty from the Union, with Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyons as the first casualty of a general in the midst of the battle. His body was one that was recovered by Confederates and kept on their side until the late afternoon of that day, and then escorted across enemy lines back to the Union. So that was an example of a general being kept and given back. Now for this battle, you have it over woodland and fields, and the bodies were scattered for weeks after the battle. This is in the early years of the war. There's not a lot of ways to deal with all of this. Whatever was taken, one day was granted to the Union to bury their dead, and they did what they could and then had to leave. It took several weeks for the Confederate troops to bury all of the dead, several weeks. And the process took so long that the local residents complained. There's dead bodies, there's horses on their land for more than a week. In that space, Confederates were buried in rows along the creek, along Wilson's Creek. And the Union dead were buried in 2 sinkholes and an old well in mass graves. And the hot August sun, this is in August, and some of the writings about it say that some of the bodies were so blackened by the sun laying out there that they were black when they were to be moved for burial. And one soldier mentioned that 2 days after the battle, during this process of cleaning, quote, "they had to be buried where they fell by digging a shallow grave and rolling them in," unquote. Now, from 1867 to 1868, the Union dead were exhumed from the known areas and reburied with honors at the newly established Springfield National Cemetery nearby. The remains of Confederate and Union soldiers were, however, still found throughout the battlefield in various stages of areas in decomposition all the way through to the early 20th century, sometimes washing up on the creek downriver, and other times just being exposed due to new construction and shifting lands. Now, these battlefields were mostly farms, and it destroyed most of the homes and farm buildings in the area, as well as most of the vegetation. And the residents there filed for more than $3 million worth of damages for crops and homes in that area. And today, it is finally, it was commemorated by Congress in 1861, but was torn apart by relic collecting over the years. In the 1960, it was designated as Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. And in the 2000s, they did a swipe of the area, trying to figure out what was left, because it seemed picked clean, and they still found little bits of artillery fragments, utensils, and parts of harmonicas found on the site. So you had a lot there. Gloria to Pass was a battle in 1862 in New Mexico and in Santa Fe and San Miguel counties, and it was a Union victory. And it took place over the course of 3 ranches that you can see pictured. We've got the Olustee's Ranch, Pigeon Ranch, and Olustee's over here. This is Johnson's Ranch. And so it took place all over there, and 147 died on the Union side and 222 on the Confederate side. The Confederates were pushing the Union to a retreat, and then the Union burned the Confederate supply depot on their way out, and so it was a Union victory. The dead were just buried in various areas across the land, and the Pigeon Ranch is where most of the battle took place. That's where the Union and Confederate both held, and so there were a lot of burials there. And the owner of Pigeon Ranch did apply for government compensation 8 years later, but when he applied, he wasn't even the owner of the ranch at the time, and so he did not get anything. A new owner of Pigeon Ranch turned it into a stop on the Santa Fe Trail and kept that going. And then once the railroad rerouted, the area fell into disrepair, and then Route 66 meant that new people were coming through the area, and a new owner turned it into a tourism site where you could see the world's oldest well, a fort that the Union and Confederates were buried at, and a Union cemetery, as well as Pueblo Indian sites. Only one of which are true, but he still used it for personal gain. Today, the site is under the Pecos National Historical Park, and so it's preserved and in various states of disrepair, and so it's not technically open to the public yet. But this is in 1987, they found the Confederate burial ground for the soldiers there, which had been completely unknown until that point when someone was digging a basement and found it. Now, Gettysburg is a very well-known battle. Results afterwards, the city or the town rallied together to take care of everything. And the dead horses piled, burned in the corners of the city. And the problem with Gettysburg is it's in the north. It was a Union victory, and visitors started coming to see the battlefield on July 5th. The battle ended July 3rd. And so you don't just have dead bodies, armies, and people in town. You have people coming in to see the site, to see it, to find their loved ones. And so you're trying to clean up while there's tourists coming through. And so that was a huge problem through Gettysburg. They did have the town banded together to create the cemetery, memorial associations, and regiments started coming in and putting memorials on the land. And that's why when you go to Gettysburg, there's so many monuments everywhere. And Gettysburg did end up in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court once and the United States Supreme Court once for various things. But it was kind of one of the first battlefields where there was a lot of issue with trying to preserve it. It was the third designated national battlefield. And it's been the National Military Park in the 1890s, and it was the third one created. And when it was created, it had 522 acres and 17 miles of roads. Currently today, it has 6,032 acres of land, 40 miles of roads, and sees about 1 million visitors a year. And so it's still a place. There used to be a lot of issues with looting. Now there has been less because there's a protection act that punishes you quite greatly if you have one. The last one is the Battle of Olustee in Florida. It was in 1864. It was a Confederate victory, and it lasted about 5 hours. And the casualties in this war were actually fairly severe. Some of the soldiers leaving this mentioned that this was the worst fighting that they had seen throughout the war, because all of the men fighting here are veterans of previous battles. On the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater, they're all veterans of it. And it was a Confederate victory, so the Union moved no further into southern Florida, but retreated back to Jacksonville. Now, this battlefield was abandoned by the Union as they retreated, and the Confederate dead were laid near the railroad and had a marker. The Union dead were buried in shallow graves. A few years later, when the Union Army came by to find out where the bodies were, they found Lieutenant Frederick Grossman of the 7th U.S. Infantry found Union remains scattered across 2 square miles of the battlefield. The wild hogs had gotten to them about a week after the battle, and all the men could do was gather up the bones. They gathered the bones, laid them to rest in a site on the battlefield, and erected a marker there, but they did not get moved to a national cemetery. And it fell into disrepair and neglect over the years, and it was eventually protected by the Daughters of the Confederacy that came in. One such woman, Mrs. J.N. Whitner, was the wife of a veteran of that battle, and she realized when some Union when Union veterans came in asking where it was, the knowledge of where this battle happened is being lost. And so she went to her local United Daughters of the Confederacy and said, we need to protect this site. They raised money through Florida, they raised money through the United States to put a marker there, and she wanted to do it as quickly as possible while there were still veterans there that remembered where it was. I didn't do it. And so they started working that. The area actually turned into, it's the oldest park in the Florida State Park system. And Battle of Olustee, they had a ceremony for the centennial of the battle in 1864 in Florida. They had a reenactment of the battle at the Gator Bowl, and the next year they wanted to do it on the battlefield. Today, that reenactment has been going on since 1984, sorry, and it is one of the largest reenactments in South Florida at the time, and it's seen as one of the most authentic reenactments in the Southeast. Now, we see all these from these quotes from newspapers and things like that, and it's the Reconstruction time that came after that could fill books, and it does fill books and things like that. But you really have families separated, soldiers coming back damaged physically and mentally, and we still feel that legacy today of just being split and brought back together. But one way that, to kind of end on a happier note, is Memorial Day or Decoration Day. This is something that came because of the mass amounts of destruction. People wanted to honor these men, these people that had fought, and so it was a way of grieving. And so separate days were set aside, and then Decoration Day was given an official day in the end of May. And the reason for that was because all across the country, flowers should be in bloom at the end of May. And so no matter where there were veterans buried, there should always be flowers nearby to put on their graves. And so That first officially started in 1866 after the anniversaries of the battles, and now it's, of course, Memorial Day, and we still celebrate that and honor the men that passed away for all the wars, not only the Civil War. So ending on that slightly happier note, I will end, and if you have any questions, please ask, but thank you for coming.